Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. So before I start lecturing, just a couple of things. I'm not going to reassign anybody from any groups. Actually, this is the first time in a long time that I haven't actually fired any groups from in a class. I almost always fire 2 or 3 groups after the first project. So this is actually the first time, I think maybe ever, that I've never fired a group ever from a class. So congratulations, that's pretty good. A lot of you actually did uh, really good jobs. It's just in terms of your groups. It was really hard to know or to judge which one was the best, because honestly, there was 3 of your groups that actually did really good jobs, and so it was really close. So hopefully, right, the second go around, which is going to be tougher, we'll see if it's that close. Hopefully, it's that close. What else was I going to say? My only critique, and I don't remember if there was this class or my other class that I'm saying this to, but I said it to them and I'll say it to you as well. The font on your PowerPoint has to be, a decent size. I don't know if you noticed my PowerPoints, but my PowerPoints, the font here is at least, I think it's 28. It might even be 32. The reason being is because it's on a screen. It's a tiny screen. It's a computer screen. You're seeing this on, I don't know how you're seeing my lectures. I don't know if you're seeing it on your phone. I don't know if you're seeing it on your computer. But the point is that you're not in a classroom where you have a big projector and you're seeing it in the classroom, and the font is right there and it's big, it's blown up. On a computer, it's not going to be blown up. So you want your font to be legible, and so it's important. It's also important that it's just not, you're not cutting and pasting from your paper and placing it on your PowerPoint. Your PowerPoint should have, a word or two, like I have right here, like a bullet point. Then you're going to elaborate about that point. This is why it's important to rehearse. Let's see what else. And so the big challenge coming up, besides having good presentations and a good paper, is the fact that it's going to be 15 minutes long. Unlike the first project where some of you went on a Monday, everybody's going to go the same day, whether it's a Monday or a Wednesday. Don't get caught off guard. I don't know when Sal's going to be available. He is a busy person, so I'm going to try to have it on a Wednesday, but don't be caught off guard if it's on a Monday. So having to do presentations in 15 minutes is challenging. So that's the big challenge moving forward for the second project. But overall, I was really happy with this group's work for the most part. Actually, a lot of you did really good work. For my overachievers, don't overdo it, because you'll end up hurting not only yourself but the group. So, manage your duties. Any questions? No questions? Zero questions? So applause, good job. Congratulate yourselves. And hopefully the second project is as good as the first. But again, the second's tougher for sure. Anyways, so this is where I left off with the first class on Monday. And we're talking about TV. Well, we left off talking about film development and TV development especially since the 1990s when the studios essentially bought a bunch of all the networks or most of the networks. It's very similar. I mean, there's some differences, but it is very similar nowadays. So just like film, you have a pitch, and if the pitch is successful, um, the studio, or in this case, the network, is going to commissioned or commission, I should say, and as opposed to past tense, it should be present tense. What I mean by commission is that the studio, well, the network, I should say, is going to commission you to go out and either finish a treatment if you don't have a treatment done. Does everybody know what a treatment is? If you've taken 301, maybe you've written a treatment in COM 301, where essentially you write out the perhaps the pilot episode in sort of an essay form. You highlight the best parts of your story in an essay form. You make sure that it sort of makes sense. So they may commission that, but if you already have a treatment completed, then they're going to have you commission the pilot script, right? The spec script, which again, if you've taken 301, then you hopefully, I don't know what they teach in 301 anymore, but I know when I taught 301, I would have the students write a treatment of their spec script, and then they would write their spec script. Spec script meaning they're essentially the pilot episode, as if they were, working on that particular show. But so anyways, they commission a treatment, they commission a script. The network is going to pay you to complete the treatment and or complete the script. And again, they don't know if they're going to approve the project. They like the idea from the pitch, and hopefully it translates well onto the printed page or the page. And then financing is negotiated. So I don't know if you guys remember, I was talking to Sal, and Sal was mentioning the idea of deficit financing. We talked about it just, a tad, the idea of how financing is negotiated. Does everybody know what I mean by deficit financing? Okay, so a couple of you said no, which is just fine. So deficit financing means that, and this is the way some deals are made. So let's just say hypothetically it costs $2.5 million per episode to make your show, your whatever show you're talking about. Let's say it's The Good Doctor, going back to Sal. And let's just say ABC in this case doesn't pay Sal's production company or whoever the producer is $2.5 million. They might just say, well, we don't have that kind of money, we'll pay you $2 million. And so that means that for every episode made of The Good Doctor, the producers are operating on a deficit finance. In other words, they have to come up with the other $500,000 themselves. And so for every episode that's aired, the showrunner is in more debt for every show. And that's referred to as deficit financing. And so meaning that the producer has to finance the other $500,000 on their own. And so again, if you were listening to the discussion that Sal and I had about his upcoming show, I asked him if they're going to have any sort of deficit financing. And he said no, that studios were going to pay for it all. And so this is what I mean by financing is negotiated. Sometimes the network will pay for everything, and therefore there's no deficit financing. And sometimes the studio, or the network in this case, will not pay for the whole entire production cost. And so therefore there's going to be a deficit, and the producer has to finance it. And so if you're wondering if this is good or bad, it's good or bad. Like any deal, like anything in life, nothing is perfect, right? There's always gives and takes with everything. And so if you're operating on a deficit finance, the good thing about it is, if the show makes it to syndication, you can negotiate a better deal on the back end. If you if you're not getting deficit financing like Sal, the issue is, of course, is that on the back end, if the show makes it into syndication, he's not they're not going to make as much money on the back end. So it's with any deal, you got to kind of weigh your options, right? Do I want to pay the price in the beginning, right? In other words, deficit financing, or do I want to pay the price at the back end, meaning that it don't make as much in syndication? So does that make sense? Deficit financing, they don't pay for the entire production. They only pay for a portion of it, and the showrunner has to make up the deficit. Is that clear? Questions? That makes sense? Oh, good. Okay. So, anyways, after all that negotiating is completed, right? Which this is where, your attorney or your manager is very important, because they can make you a lot of money or they can lose you a lot of money. And so this is why, if you're paying an attorney $500 an hour, pay them or her, because they're worth it. They're going to save you some money in the long run. Anyway, so then it's discussed whether or not there's going to be a pilot episode made. So pilot mean referring to the first episode. Will it be produced? So obviously there's always going to be a first episode, which is referred to as a pilot. The questioning here is sometimes now, especially nowadays, especially since Netflix, is that the studio will just say, you know what, just make us a half a season of episodes. Obviously, a pilot's going to be one of them. And so just make us 13 shows and let's see how it goes. Sometimes the network will say, well, just make a pilot, which means just one episode. We don't know if we like 13 episodes just yet. Just make us one and let's see how it goes. And so hence the question, pilot. Will a pilot be produced? Well, it's always produced, but sometimes studios will ask for the pilot only, and sometimes they will ask for a half a season. And generally speaking, a half a season in television is 13 episodes. It varies between 20 and 26 episodes per season, but if they're going to order a half a season, generally it's about 13. So anyways, at that point in time, the executives watch the pilot and they decide whether or not they like the pilot, yes or no. If they say yes, or they're sort of ho-hum about it, they may do some market research to sort of see if they like the episode. And so they'll do focus groups to test the pilot, whether or not they like the show. So for instance, years ago, when I was still somewhat cool, not cool anymore, but I got invited to go watch, oh gosh, what show was it? Jane the Virgin. I think it was Jane the Virgin. Jane the Virgin. I got invited to go watch Jane the Virgin as part of a focus group, where we met the producers and the stars. I talked about the show. They had a screen for us, and we chit-chatted about the program, and they asked us whether or not we would like the show. I actually liked the show. The first episode was good. The first season was good, actually. So they do these focus groups and see whether or not they like the show. And the next step, which I didn't mention here, after that, is they'll do upfront after the market research. Does everybody know what upfront means? So I should have added down here. Upfront, does everybody know what upfront means? Yes, exactly, Georgette. Up front. That's exactly right. So typically speaking, um, upfront takes place in New York. Generally speaking, in the summertime before the fall season. And the whole point, as Georgette pointed out, they essentially screen these shows for advertisers, and they're essentially trying to figure out whether or not the advertisers like the show, whether or not they're interested in buying time for the show. This applies to both basic cable as well as um, general market, traditional television networks, Spanish language, whatever. Any network that relies on advertising, the two upfronts. And the whole point of that is to try to secure as much advertisers on the show as possible. And the good part for the advertiser is that the advertiser gets to buy time at a discounted rate. And so it's sort of a win-win for the advertiser as well as for the network. And so, anyways, nowadays, TV development is a year-round process. It happens year-round. It used to be that most of the time development would start for TV networks would be right around the fall season, right around in August. They would start producing television shows. Now it happens all the time, and generally speaking, nowadays pilots debut in the fall. Of course, that's also doesn't change. It's still generally the fall if that's their first choice. Sometimes some pilots will air in October or November, depending on how the shows are performing. They might be filling in for a show that's the ratings are poor. So Netflix has totally changed the traditional model of television. It's Netflix is really changing movies as well as changing television. And so what I mean by that is generally speaking, Netflix doesn't have a pilot. They they just order if they like a show, they order X number of episodes. Obviously the pilot's one of them. But they don't call it a pilot, just say just we want 10 episodes and make it for us. Also, they are very hands off when it comes to production, something that the networks are not. The networks are all about development and having executives always give you all sorts of feedback. Netflix, by all accounts, is very hands off, and they let you do what you're going to do, and so you go out and just do it. And also, what Netflix does is that they support the content or the show with the showrunners with a 30% premium. So obviously with Netflix, right, you're not you may or may not have syndication, but you may not. And so in order to offset the loss of syndication revenue, Netflix just pays the showrunners a 30% premium on top of whatever their fee was. So it's their fee plus 30% because Netflix knows that syndication may or may not happen. So Netflix has done, I think a really good job of with its content. Um, and so it's changing movies, it's changing TV, and I'll show you a video about how it's changing movies shortly. So now some networks may opt to produce with no pilot because they're following the Netflix model. Um, and so also the seasons on Netflix are shorter, and so therefore they spend less money on development, which again, this is where the 30% premium goes to. They spend money on less on development, and so they're able to give more to the showrunner. And last but not least, TV and cable networks rarely produce independent projects. In other words, if you send them a script, I don't know if any of you are writers or producers or anything like that, and you just don't blindly send scripts to the networks. They're not going to read them. When I used to work in the film industry, I would get scripts and I wouldn't even open the envelopes. I would just throw them in the trash. Well, I would open it because I would want to see what's in there, but if I saw that it was a script, I would just throw it in the trash can. There's all sort of legal issues that are around it, and so this is the reason why if you blindly send a project to a network, television network or cable network or premium network or a studio, they're not going to read it. They're going to throw it in the trash. Generally speaking, you need to have a manager or an agent, and usually some sort of agency or something like that is what hands or delivers the projects to the various networks, whether it's cable or TV. So please don't waste your time and send scripts. All right, so this is a little bit about how Netflix is changing movies, but it's also changing TV, as I just mentioned.
Netflix is revolutionizing the way we watch TV, but some fear that Netflix could be closing the curtains on the big screen. So, is there any evidence to suggest that our love for streaming movies at home could spell the end for cinema? US-based company Netflix has had more than a few reasons to celebrate recently. It's added a record-breaking number of paid users to its online streaming service in 2018, now topping 139 million worldwide. That's 3 times the number of accounts just 5 years ago. Keep in mind that more than one person could be using an account, so its reach is even bigger. The USA is Netflix's top market globally, with over 40% of all paid users based there. The company has also invested heavily into producing original content, including big movie blockbusters. Analysts estimate that the company spent $13 billion on titles like Narcos and Bird Box in 2018. That would be enough to make Titanic one of the most expensive films ever made 65 times. Its efforts seem to be paying off. This year, its critically acclaimed film Roma has earned the streaming service its first Best Picture Oscar nomination, with 10 in total. You might think that can only benefit the box office, but Netflix has been criticised for showing films in a relatively small number of movie theatres and for a limited time before streaming them on its own site. So, are there any signs that cinemas are suffering? Not really. While analysts said that 2017 was a tough year for movie makers, last year saw a boost for the box office. Worldwide, cinemas made over $41.5 billion. That's 2.6% more than in 2017. The top 3 markets, the USA, China, and the UK, all saw increases in revenues too. And moviegoers in America generated nearly $12 billion for the industry. There are other reasons to be skeptical of the suggestions that the rising popularity of Netflix is to blame for the perceived decline of cinema. Comparing the trends in cinema revenues and streaming services tells us little about how one impacts the other. Just like the consumption of mozzarella cheese can't really explain the rise in the number of civil engineering doctorates awarded, even though they're both going up. There are a number of other factors at play which are likely to contribute to the possible success or failure of cinemas and streaming services. But is there any evidence to suggest that Netflix and movie theatres are competing for audiences? That's a tricky one too. One US study by NATO, that's the National Association of Theatre Owners in the States, not the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, surveyed just under 2,000 people in the US who both streamed content and saw at least one film in the cinema over the last year. They found that people who watch a lot of stream programs also go to the cinema frequently, while those who don't subscribe rarely visit the movie theatre either. But even that doesn't tell us conclusively about how the use of one platform actually affects people's cinema habits. Remember, it was thought that bringing televisions into homes in the 1950s could kill off Hollywood too. And Like TV and cinemas, streaming services such as Netflix face a few challenges of their own. Netflix uses debt to finance its spending on content and has said it will raise prices in the USA and in Latin America as it needs to make more cash. The cheapest plan will now be $8.99 a month. That's about the same price for seeing a movie at a cinema, with a ticket costing $8.97 in the US. Could that make streamers switch off? The company will also see stiff competition, not just from the likes of Amazon, which has picked up a few awards of its own, but also Disney+. Disney's streaming service is due to launch in late 2019. That will strip Netflix of several popular Disney-owned shows on its platform. Either way, cinema lovers need not panic for now.
So anyways, what she's saying is true, and I think this was 2018. So about the idea that Netflix was in deep debt. And I mean, they're still in debt, but now actually Netflix is now earning more money than it owes. So it's actually paying off its debt now, which is good. I mean, it's still in debt, but it's paying off its debt. So whatever debt Netflix currently has, it's good debt because it's actually they're using that money to generate more money, and this is how, and through generating more money, now they're paying off their debt. So don't worry about Netflix; they'll be just fine. As a matter of fact, Netflix is considered to be the most, well, last I checked, the most valuable company on Wall Street, even more valuable than Disney. Of course, so we'll see what happens after Disney Plus really takes off, which in that case, I think Disney will probably pass up Netflix again. But anyways, so development hell. And so this is going back to what I was talking about, how one thing that Netflix does a little bit better than the networks, as well as the studios, because the studios especially do this, is this idea of development hell. And in other words, Netflix is very hands-off about development and lets the process just happen. The studios and the networks, not so much, especially the studios. And so what ends up happening, reasons for development hell, which means that the reason they call it development hell is because a movie stays in development for, seems like, forever. And sometimes it never gets out of development hell. In other words, you thought the movie's going to get made, but it, for whatever reason, never got made. And so there's several reasons for that. But here are some primary ones. So the original writer is replaced, and oftentimes it's replaced by a person called a script doctor. So what ends up happening is that the studios will hire the original writer to do rewrites or whatever, and maybe the original writer doesn't like some of the changes, or just sometimes just gets simply, fired from the job. And in that case, they bring in a script doctor. The script doctor literally fixes the script, right? So if a scene needs to be rewritten, if a plot twist needs to be changed, those sorts of things gets replaced by a script doctor. Are these changes good? Well, I don't know. Sometimes they are, and I suppose sometimes they're not. And so development can last a long time, or it can even go into turnaround. So turnaround means that the movie is on the process of being made, but then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, goes into turnaround. In other words, it stops and it goes back to step one, essentially. And it could happen because the star that's attached to the script maybe finds another project, or simply doesn't like the direction of the project and quits. Same could happen with the director. The director is attached to the project, could simply decide to leave, or maybe they're again assigned to another movie, or something went on with that director and star. The executive who green lighted the project could also decide, well, he just gets fired because people in the movie industry are constantly getting fired. The idea of job security, at least when it comes to motion pictures, well, forget about it. It's not a thing. And then also simple anxiety. So meaning that anytime you hear about an executive leaving, that executive gets replaced by somebody else, this new person doesn't want to get fired by continuing the project of this old executive. So it makes the new executive nervous about the current projects that are in the pipeline. If that new executive wants to get, well, it doesn't want to get fired, but if that executive is going to get fired, he or she wants to get fired through the the lack of quality of their own projects, not the lack of quality of somebody else's projects. And so that simple anxiety could lengthen the project. In other words, that new executive could just say, well, I want to meet with the writer and the director and see what's going on. So also the idea of rewritings, going back to the idea of script doctors. So the real danger, I don't know how many of you have written scripts or write scripts, but just changing one scene can change the entire, direction of the story, or even the tone of the story. And so that's the real danger, right? It's just, even though the script doctor is fixing the script, changing one little thing could ruin the whole thing, right? It's kind of like the phrase, one bad apple ruins the whole bunch, right? It's the same sort of idea. One bad scene that's changed could have a ripple effect and really change or just ruin the story. And so the weakness, and this is why, again, Netflix generally does a better job than the studios and the networks when it comes to this, is that development doesn't always improve the story. That's the weakness. Sometimes development doesn't make the story better, it ruins the story. So here's some stories or some movies that took forever to make because of development hell.
Land. Years to make, 20. World War II got in the way of this movie, and that's because its director, Leni Riefenstahl, put the shoot on hold to work on propaganda films for the Nazi regime. In fact, you may know her work from Hitler's Nuremberg rally documentary, Triumph of the Will.
Adolf Hitler, der Führer der deutschen Jugend, hat das Wort.
Wartime destruction displaced the production several times. Thus, Riefenstahl had to relocate to Spain and the Czech Republic at several points in order to finish her work. Unable to pin down an actress of her liking, Riefenstahl even cast herself in the lead role, and later regretted it. By that point, she had just turned 40, while 23-year-old Franz Eichberger played her lover. All in all, the romantic picture took 2 decades to get on screen, still holding the record for the live-action movie with the longest production time. Number 2, Boyhood. Years to make, 12.
You don't want the bumpers. Life doesn't give you bumpers.
Perhaps the most famous film whose production relied on the passage of time. Richard Linklater's coming-of-age drama took 12 years to shoot.
I just feel like there are so many things that I could be doing and probably want to be doing that I'm just not.
IFC Films entrusted Linklater with a budget of $200,000. And each year from 2002 to 2013, a young Eller Coltrane would meet with Linklater and crew to record a time-lapse of his adolescence, his relationship with mother Patricia Arquette and father Ethan Hawke, highlighting the very essence of growing up.
You said that was going to be my car when I turned 16.
What? No, I didn't. I never said that.
From the world events captured in the background, like President Barack Obama's election, to a soundtrack chronicling evolutions in radio pop, this cinematic breakthrough is truly a time capsule that can only exist because it took so long to make.
I'm really happy that you're hanging out with us.
Yeah. You too.
Before we unveil our number one pick, here are some honorable mentions.
They know they're facing the gas chamber and they don't care. That's what people don't understand. They don't care.
वो पाँव जो मेरे दिल में छुपे रहते थे, आज उन्हें मैं सबके सामने नाचता हुआ देखूंगा.
Soy Jesús. Gris.
Number 1, The Thief and the Cobbler. Years to make, 28.
Wait, Father! Something's happening!
Although several versions of this film have been released, we're going with the 1993 cut that's also known as The Princess and the Cobbler. This animated fantasy took a lifetime of work before it reached audiences, since animator Richard Williams took on outside jobs to raise money for his dream project starting in 1964.
Gentlemen, what a delight.
After a stream of story revisions and countless failures to secure funding, it wasn't until the 80s that Williams' work caught the eye of Steven Spielberg, who hired him to helm the Academy Award-winning Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
All right, Weasel, grab some sky and let the judge have it. You heard me, I said drop it.
Although this helped him score a deal with Warner Brothers, a rough version of the film was deeply unsuccessful, leading producers to pull out. Because of the disastrous length of production, loads of completed animation ultimately hit the cutting room floor, and Williams was eventually stripped of all control, leading to multiple versions of the film being released.
This lowborn cobbler of no worth attacked me in the square today. Shall we take his head away?
Do you agree with our list?
You don't wanna fucking know.
Which films do you think Hollywood took way too long to make? For more persistent top 10s published every...
So Boyhood isn't exactly the best example of development hell, but certainly this last one is a good example of development hell, where, you know, the filmmaker gets fired and all sorts of people got fired just to make before the final movie gets even made. So I think it's 28 years. And so this happens a lot, especially for movies, because there's so much money being invested and the studios don't, you know, obviously don't want to lose money. And so they want to get it right. But again, development could ruin the story, unfortunately. Questions. Yeah, I don't know about that, but it was a good story. It was a good movie. So yeah, maybe I did. Maybe you're right. It's very possible that The Queen's Gambit was too long. It was probably going to be a miniseries, and networks, at least not recently, don't make miniseries. And so you're right, Natalie, that it very well could have taken 30 years to make, because essentially was a miniseries. It's too long for a movie, and it's not long enough for an entire television season. So yeah, I believe that. I mean, I don't know that, but it makes sense on why it would take 30 years. It's a good show, by the way. I don't know if anybody's seen it. It makes me want to play chess again. So anyways, production decides what ideas get produced. And so people think of this as a glamorous job and a cool job, and it is. I mean, it's cool. Anytime you're working in development, whether it's TV or movies, it's cool. If you're doing development for Netflix, cool. I guess the one drawback to the high pay is the long hours. I read this so I do this industry interview assignment for 346, where I have my students go out and interview somebody who works in the industry. One of the common phrases that I hear from students, which, by the way, nothing wrong with this, is that they don't want to work long hours. They want to work their 40 hours a week and that's it. Well, in entertainment, the idea of 40 hours a week it's not really a thing. It's usually, if you're doing anything in development or in production, you're working very long hours. You're working 50, 60 hours a week, you're reading scripts, you're in meetings, in traffic if you live in Orange County and trying to commute into Hollywood. So it is really long hours. So you really have to love it if you're going to do it. You really have to know the film business in terms of trends, in terms of knowing how the film business works. You really have to have a good knowledge of the history of TV, the history of film, because you really need to know what's worked in the past, right, and what doesn't work obviously right now, which leads me to current trends and future trends. Is you obviously have to know trends that are currently happening, but you also have to know or have an idea of what will be the future trends moving forward in our society, which is tricky, right? This idea of knowing trends is tough. This is why young people are hired to work in Hollywood, because they're hoping that you young folks know the future trends, because once you get to a certain age, it's hard to predict. Business affairs. Business affairs deals with the writers, the actors, the directors, in terms of negotiating, monetary deals with the individual writers, how much the writers get paid, actors, directors, so on and so forth. And of course, you have number 3, the legal department. And those are the ones that deal with all the long form contracts. I don't know if anybody's ever read a contract done by a studio or by a network. It is insanely long. Even the boilerplate contract, which boilerplate means boilerplate, I should say, contracts, which means standard, are insanely long. And so the legal department deals with these long form contracts. And one of these long form contracts is called a PFD deal, which stands for production, finance, and distribution. And this lays out, what's going to happen production-wise in terms of what the producer is responsible for, what the production is going to look like, those sorts of things. The F stands for financing, how much money is going to be given, what happens if you go over budget, those sorts of things. And then the D means distribution. How will the film be distributed? What's going to be a break even or not break even? Those sorts of things are all discussed in this long, long contract. And this is why you have to hire a very good attorney to make sense of all the lingo, because it's pretty dense. So all production and post-production executives are hired. They work alongside development to oversee the production of content, as well as oversee post-production, which, is referred to as sweetening the movie, right? This is where you add in the special effects, redo dialogue, all sorts of things. So one big difference, one of the things that some students, I don't know if my capstone students have this problem, but certainly my 346 students have this problem. They see network TV and basic cable as essentially the same, but it's not. They're different. And so if you don't know the difference, just some basic differences. Network TV has to operate under the FCC, but more specifically, they have to deal with this Broadcast Decency Enforcement Act of 2005. Who was the president in 2005? That was George Bush, the second Bush. And basically, a network will be fined, I believe it was $325,000 per incident, or up to $3 million if they air content that's inappropriate. And so this is why networks are try to be very careful about what they put on screen, because of this Broadcast Decency Enforcement Act that will fine them up to $3 million, which is obviously a lot of money. And this is the reason why standards and practices are in place. So standards and practices essentially are the censors that censor content before it gets released to the public. And so they're very critical because this is how the network avoids being fined by the FCC, which basic cable is very different than network TV. The FCC does not regulate content of basic cable, so don't make that mistake. It is self-regulated, right? Basic cable is self-regulated. And so meaning that the target audience essentially helps to regulate it. In other words, you're not going to have a very, very violent scenes in a television show if kids are watching, right? Advertisers aren't going to want to buy ads or place their ads on programs if it's going to offend people. So advertisers sort of help to self-regulate. The viewers' expectations of what there's going to be watching on basic cable also helps to self-regulate. And so you're not going to see a whole lot of violence or profane language or nudity on basic cable, at least not during their prime time hours. Premium cable, on the other hand, right? It's the wild, wild west. They can do whatever they want. HBO, Showtime. They can show as much violence as they want, as much sex as they want, because there's no advertiser pressure. So advertisers help to keep basic cable and help to keep network TV in line. And so the TV parental guidelines, which is very similar to the MPA ratings, started in 1997. And this is essentially to help parents figure out what is appropriate content for their kids. So any questions on the difference between network TV, basic cable, and premium cable? Okay, marketing. So, Jaws. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the show Jaws, because obviously it's over 40 years old now. So, gosh, I'm old. But anyways, so if you're not familiar with the show Jaws, this is just a trailer of the show. Well, actually, it's a
Jaws stunned and terrified audiences from the moment it hit the screen in 1975. The movie literally invented the summer blockbuster, turning director Steven Spielberg into a household name, as it had author Peter Benchley, who wrote the bestseller the year before. Benchley's inspiration was a news report of a 4,000-pound shark caught off the east coast of Long Island.
He heard about a great white that was caught off of Montauk. This got him thinking that what if a shark like that hung around? When Peter wrote Jaws, our knowledge of sharks was really minimal.
Like any good story, there's a grain of truth in it. And, the rogue shark theory and the rogue shark story in Jaws is a good one. Peter Benchley studied sharks. And at the time, in 1974, there wasn't a lot of evidence that a rogue shark couldn't exist. He was really writing what he knew.
Benchley's research was limited by scientific proof. Gaps in facts were filled with fiction.
Peter Benchley was writing what a lot of people thought. The fear of being eaten by a shark is a real fear.
People had a feeling that a shark was after humans, and maybe once they tasted human flesh, they would stay.
The monster of Jaws was born, a rogue great white with a very bad attitude. But transforming hit book into mega hit movie was no easy job.
Peter and I thought that Steven Spielberg did an absolutely superb job. I mean, he took a novel and made it sing in so many different ways.
It's hard to remember now that the filming of Jaws was a famous disaster. Nothing worked, including the oversized mechanical creature that was supposed to portray the killer shark.
They first tested the shark out in California in a swimming pool and it worked fine. They were all excited, they were happy, okay, we did it, let's bring it to Martha's Vineyard. They stick it in the ocean, the pneumatics of it fizzled up in the salt water, and it just fell to the bottom of Cow Bay. It just set the tone for the rest of the movie, where there was one disaster after another.
And yet, the 27-year-old director refused to back down from his vision, even tempting fate by enlisting real sharks to tell his story. This was considered a very bad idea at the time.
Shark Week, all this weekend now.
All right, so the video does a little bit of a good job of describing a little bit about the movie. It was Jaws was really the first high concept movie, right? This idea that it packaged, right, a director and these stars, and it was based off of a book that was one of the best-selling books. And so one of the things that Universal did that changed marketing was that they front-loaded the marketing campaign. So again, they front-loaded the marketing campaign. And what I mean by front loading is that they essentially spent all their advertising budget before the movie was released. Now, nowadays, that's very common, that the studios will spend, most of their ad budget during the first week before the first opening weekend. And before, what distributors would do before Jaws is that they would release the movie in one market, usually in one theater or maybe a couple theaters. They would market the movie in that particular market. If the movie did well, they would go to two markets. And then they would market the movie in two markets, and it would have screens obviously in those two markets. And if it did well in those two markets, it'd go to 4. They would then go to 8 and then go to 16. So they did what's platform releases for the most part. And they would only do market by market advertising. And so with Jaws, they ended up placing the movie on over 400 screens, so that they did a saturation distribution style, which is now common. Again, it was new then. They also saturated the market with television, advertising, and billboards and all sorts of things. So they saturated the market with marketing and advertising, as well as with distribution. And again, this is all new because the studios, again, for the most part, did platform distribution, and they would only market the movie in the markets that they were in and slowly build a buzz. But with Jaws, Universal saturated the entire country with marketing and distributed the movie all over the market before the movie was even during the first week box office. And Jaws changed the way that studios marketed movies and changed the way that they distributed movies. This is why nowadays, for let's say a Marvel movie, it's on 4,000 screens. Right? They saturate the market. They saturate the market with advertising to let everybody know that this Marvel movie's on 4,000 screens. Or then let them know that's out in the theaters, and they can easily go to a movie theater to watch the movie. But that sort of marketing and that sort of distribution started with Jaws. And so again, Jaws changed marketing and changed distribution because they front-loaded with television advertising, and they spent most of their ad money before the movie was released. They saturated the market with distribution. In other words, they put the movie on 400 screens or 450 screens, which again was unusual because most of the time, the way movies were distributed, they were done with platforms. In other words, 1, 2, 4, 8. It would increase it slowly, but Universal did a saturation distribution release as well. So again, Jaws changed the way movies were marketed and distributed because Universal saturated the marketplace. Blair Witch also changed marketing because it really was the first movie to really take advantage of social media to create a viral marketing campaign. I don't remember if I told this group or not this group. So the movie, obviously, if you haven't seen it, it's about these 3 filmmakers who disappear in Maryland. And I used to live in Maryland. And so when I was living in Texas, when I was living in Austin, Texas, I got an email to tell me to check out this movie trailer, The Blair Witch Project, and people were asking me, because they knew I used to live in Maryland, if this was a true story. And I watched the trailer, thought, it's a pretty cool trailer, but not true. But anyways, that's how the movie created a giant buzz virally, because so Amaret Jones and some other folks did a really good job of utilizing social media and creating a gigantic buzz. And so Blair Witch really provided a good template on how to best use social media to promote a movie. So target audiences, marketing is responsible for trying to reach this target audience. Who is the target audience? So obviously the first thing that you try to do with the target audience is, okay, what's the demographics? So meaning the age group, or what's the maybe the race or ethnicity of this particular group, and how do you best reach this particular group? Does this group spend a lot of time on social media? Do they spend a lot of time watching television? Are they out walking around? In other words, so are billboards going to work? Are they avid moviegoers? So should we release lots of trailers? How do we best reach this audience? And even more important than perhaps figuring out the demographics is understanding the psychographics of your target audience, right? It's the behavior, your personality. People who watch horror movies are different than people who go watch dramas, right? And it's important to understand who goes to watch horror movies, right? There's a certain type of person that goes watch a horror movie. So these are thrill seekers, right? People who don't mind being scared. As a matter of fact, they want to be scared. They want to scream. They want to yell. They want to perspire. They want to have sweaty palms. Whatever. There's a certain type of person who goes watch a horror film versus a drama. There's a certain type of person who goes watch an independent film versus a studio film, right? There's reasons why some people dislike Marvel movies and some people love them. So who are these folks? And it's important to understand the personality of your target audience, because it will help you market your film better if you understand the personality of your target audience. And so the budget, generally speaking, the budget could really vary. It's all over the place when it comes to movies. It really depends on the type of movie you have. So listen, the filmmaker's always going to say, my movie's for everybody. Of course the filmmaker's going to say that. Is the filmmaker lying? No, the filmmaker is not lying. The filmmaker is telling the truth. In his mind or her mind, they're making a film for everybody. But in the eyes of marketing, they don't have the budget to reach everybody. So they got to make some decisions. Like, okay, so yes, this movie is for everybody, potentially, but who's more likely to go watch this movie? So we got to figure out, what type of person is most likely to watch it, and that's going to affect the budget, right? So if these folks spend a lot of time watching TV, well, TV advertising is expensive, and so therefore the budget's going to go up. And so, but generally speaking, if you look down here, for studios, it's about 40 to 50% of the production budget. So if the movie was produced for $200 million, they're going to spend about $100 million on marketing. And then they're going to utilize market research to try to avoid box office bombs, using tracking studies, test screenings, those sorts of things. When I say tracking studies, do you guys know what I mean by a tracking study? No. Okay. Where their eyes look first. No, but that is actually something that is studied, Alexis. Advertisers do study which part your eyes look at first on a billboard or any sort of advertisement. They do study what your eyes see first, because apparently there's parts of the screen that your eyes look at first. I want to say it's depending on what side is dominant, but you are right. But anyways, that's not tracking studies. But so tracking studies this is big within marketing and distribution folks. So long before the movie's release, so usually it's about 3 months out, they start tracking the movie. In other words, they have a list of the movies that are going to be released, right? And so they get a percentage of folks. Well, they ask folks, which movie are you most apt to see during this weekend? And to try to also test awareness. And so usually, obviously, if you're 3 months out, you're at like 1% or 2%. And so, but the point is that as it get closer to the debut date, let's just say that you're going to be released in April 14th or April 10th this weekend. By this point in time, they're hoping the tracking study is going to go from 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%. So now we're like a few weeks, a week out. They're hoping the tracking study says at least 10%. That means that 10% of the people polled have your movie as a first choice. And so if your movie's less than 10% and you're part of a studio, you know your movie's in trouble, because based on the tracking, your movie is not the number one choice in the marketplace. Studios, at the very least, want your movie to be tracking at least 10% the week of the release. At least, if not 20 or 25 or 30, the higher the number, the better it is. But that tracking number essentially tells the studio, of all the moviegoers that were polled, this movie's going to be their number one choice if they go to the movies that weekend. And that's tracking studies. They're tracking what moviegoers are going to watch for that particular week. And they start tracking it long in advance. So studios, the way movies are done, there's something called a P&A charge plus a 10% overhead. So P&A stands for print and advertising. So the studios are going to charge the producer whatever it costs them to produce the prints, as well as they're going to charge them for advertising, the marketing costs. Plus, if the producer decided to go with the studio, in other words, they didn't hire a third party to market the movie, they decided to let the studio market the movie, the studio is going to charge you a 10% overhead. So let's just say that you spent $100 million on P&A, and there's going to be a 10% overhead charge on top of that $100 million. So The studios did your marketing, it's 100 million plus 10%, which means 110 million. Studios still rely very heavily on marketing movies on network TV and cable TV, even though it's really expensive. The best day to market a movie is on Thursdays. The reason that it's Thursdays the best day is, generally speaking, does anybody know why Thursday is generally considered the best day for marketing a movie, at least historically speaking? That's right. That's right, Jacob. That's right, Georgette. A lot of us don't plan our weekends until Thursday. Honestly, we don't think about our weekend until we actually, like, the day before. We're like, what are we doing this weekend? Well, I don't know, honey. What are we doing this weekend? It's a good question. And so let's go watch a movie. And what do we want to watch? And the ad pops up on Thursday. Oh, let's go check out this movie. And so Thursday, as Georgette pointed out, and as well as Jacob, it's because it influences people's plans making for the weekend. That's exactly right. We don't plan our weekends until Thursdays. And so that's why Thursday traditionally is the best day to market a movie, generally speaking. And so again, studios spend about 50% of their production budget on marketing. And how do you know a marketing campaign worked? For some of you who are doing the film case studies, it's not necessarily the overall box office. That doesn't tell us whether or not the movie worked. I mean, it partially does, but more or less that tells you that the people liked the movie. You know the movie campaign worked when the first week's box office was good. The first week's box office tells all of us whether or not the marketing campaign worked, because it got you into the theaters during that opening week. Now, whether or not you like the movie, well, that's going to be based on what happens the following second, third, and fourth weeks. Marketing did its job as long as people went the opening weekend. And afterwards, the story might have failed. Now, let's show you this. So distribution, I think this is probably my last slide I'll talk about, because I think it's getting close to 12:45. So distribution. Distribution can be more expensive than a regular movie, especially if it's a studio specialty film, because these studio specialty or art films, usually the production costs are pretty low. So it wouldn't be surprising to have distribution be more expensive than production for those sorts of movies. For studio movies, not the case. Generally, studio movies, the production cost is more expensive than distribution costs. Distribution is really critical. It's really important in terms of how a movie is distributed, how it's marketed, because whatever the movie makes theatrically, it's going to drive the revenue for other revenue streams in terms of, like, the box office for a movie determines how much the studio is going to charge, let's say, a cable network to air the movie. It's going to determine how the streaming revenue. It's going to determine the pay-per-view revenue. It's going to determine how many DVDs it sold. So the theatrical revenue drives the other revenue streams down the way. It even drives, to a certain extent, how much money the movie will make with merchandising, to some extent. And so the studios utilize something called windowing. Windowing is how they maximize revenue. Windowing. So windowing means that they do a window for theatrical distribution. They do a window for DVDs. They do a window for streaming. They do a window for cable. They do a window for network TV, et cetera, et cetera. And so one thing that you have to sort of figure out with distribution is that are you relying more on media or word of mouth initially? So as I said before, right, you know that a marketing campaign worked when the first weekend was successful. And so anytime you do a wide release, like a saturation release or a wide release, you rely more on media because you're having media to generate a word of mouth for you. Now, if you do a platform release or an exclusive release, platform meaning that you release it in one market or one theater and then release it and then slowly broaden the theater, or broaden the release, I should say, you're relying more on word of mouth with a platform or with an exclusive, because you're relying on people to say, go check out this movie, this is a good movie. So for distribution, you have to figure out what are you relying on most in the beginning. So with most studio movies, you rely more on media, and with the smaller movies, you rely more on word of mouth. The toughest to execute in terms of distribution is the platform release, because the platform release, you have to you have to extend the release of the movie as the word of mouth is occurring. So if you wait too long to release the movie or to expand the movie, the word of mouth dies. If you expand it too quickly, the word of mouth hasn't caught up to the expansion, so it's going to die as well. So you have to expand the movie as the word of mouth is increasing. So a good example would be Juno, right? The movie Juno, they did a really good job of expanding the release as the word of mouth was increasing, right? But that kind of release is really difficult. It's really hard. One of the big issues right now, especially with streaming, is piracy. And so this is why some studios are now doing day and dates. Does everybody know what I mean by a day and date? Day and date essentially means you synchronize the release, let's say of a streaming, but also do it theatrically at the same time. The idea, if you release it on streaming as well as theatrically, is that you're going to reduce the number of piracy. And I think it's already 12:47, so shoot. So I'll leave off on Monday talking about distribution fees.